Welcome to another edition of Superhero Seminary. I'm Professor Baracus. Today we're going to look at a passage in the New Testament about my favorite word. I'll give you one guess what it is. That's right, I pity the fool that don't get this one right. What are you, some millennial? You don't even know who I am. Now the problem is that there's a verse in the Bible that would seem to say that I'm on my way to hell. Let's look at it. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is giving his Sermon on the Mount, and he says the following. You have heard it said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. So this seems pretty cut and dry. If you call somebody a fool, you're going to hell. That's how I've heard it told. But here's the catch. In this same gospel, just a few chapters later, look what Jesus says. In Matthew 23:16, Jesus is now talking to the Pharisees and the leaders in Jerusalem. And he says this, woe to you, blind guides. You say if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is bound by the oath. You blind fools, which is greater? The gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? So here apparently Jesus is contradicting himself. In the first instance he said, you call somebody a fool, you're in danger of hellfire. And he used the Greek word more. That's where we get the word moron from in English. It also happens to sound like the Hebrew word for rebel, but it probably just means fool. And then in Matthew 23:17 he uses the plural of that same word, moroi. So Jesus says, fools to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the leaders of Jerusalem. What's going on? Is Jesus contradicting himself, class? Well, it's important when interpreting scripture to understand some things about how it was written. And in this case, as with many of the sayings of Jesus, it's important to understand today's word, hyperbole. That's right, hyperbole. Hyperbole is a rhetorical exaggeration, figure of speech often used by Jewish wisdom teachers to underline their point. The point of Jesus' hyperbolic illustrations is generally to grab the hearer's attention and force that hearer to take his point serious. We know that Jesus' Sermon on the Mount words run into trouble if you take them literally. Otherwise, you got people running around gouging out their eyes, cutting off their right hands. After all, that's what Jesus said to do if it causes you to sin. But Jesus was a Hebrew prophet, and Hebrew prophets used shocking imagery, and they used hyperbole and exaggeration to get the listener to think about their inner motives. And that's exactly what he's doing by warning people going around calling everybody fools or raka. By the way, raka just means empty head. It's roughly equivalent to fool. It's not better or worse. It's just an Aramaic word, and fool is a Greek word, but they mean roughly the same thing. So what Jesus is saying using this hyperbole in the Sermon on the Mount is he's not giving us an escalating scale from local courts to the judgment bar of God, but a declaration of the absolute will of God, who wills not only that persons not kill each other, but also that there be no hostility between human beings, according to New Testament scholar Eugene. Or as R.T. France says, this is not an injunction merely to avoid certain abusive expressions, that'd just be another form of legalism, but to submit our thoughts about other people as well as the words they give rise to God's penetrating judgment. My man Craig Keener, he says, although condemning anger and insults, Jesus himself expressed grieved indignation and called people fools under appropriate circumstances, like in chapter 23, verse 17. But he goes on to warn, yet our own indignation is too easily excused as, quote, righteous. And even just anger must be expressed productively, never in a manner harmful to another person. Thus, when debating with those like the religious leaders in Jesus' day, we must speak responsibly for their correction and accept the personal consequence. When dealing with those closest to us, such as a spouse, we must be humble ourselves and seek the other person's best interest in love. So if you're going to call somebody a fool, 1, you better really mean it. 2, they better really deserve it. And 3, the goal of you saying it should be for their restoration and their correction and their edification. You don't want to leave them as fools. You want to help them change. But that's what Jesus is doing. He's getting to the heart. Jesus always pushes past the outer and the legalistic and the ways that we can find loopholes and say, well, I didn't really break this commandment. Jesus says, no, the Spirit of God can see into your heart. Look down in your heart, fool. What's in there? Is it honoring God? Or are you trying to play legal games with the Almighty? Because when you belittle somebody needlessly, you belittling not only them, not only yourself, but the God in which both of you are made. And by the way, the ancient translators of the New Testament recognized that Jesus wasn't speaking in an absolute, that he was using hyperbole, because some manuscripts introduce in Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus says if anyone is angry, they introduce the word eke, without reason. In other words, they knew that what Jesus was talking about was unreasonable anger, not righteous anger, because Jesus would go on to show righteous anger. So no, Jesus isn't saying if you call somebody a fool, you're going to hell. What he is saying is if you call somebody a fool, you better check your inner motives, because you're going to be in the danger of God's judgment. You're in the danger of not a human court only, but of Gehenna. That's the valley of Hinnom outside of Jerusalem. Back in the Old Testament times, some of Israel's evil kings used it to offer child sacrifices to the god Moloch. It became a place that was unclean, impure. It's where they dumped the trash from the city. There were fires always burning and maggots, worms that never died, dogs fighting over scraps scraps of trash and corpses. It was a nasty place, a terrible, unclean place, the last place you want to go if you were a faithful Torah-following Jew. And that's why, by the time before Jesus, it became known as a metaphor or a symbol for the reality of being apart from God. It became a metaphor for hell itself, and that's how Jesus uses it. If what's inside you comes out, and it looks like what's going on down in Gehenna, that's the very thing you're in danger of becoming. N.T. Wright put it this way. He says, if you let your anger turn into foul and abusive language, sooner or later you may find yourself in court. And if you're the sort of person who sneers at everybody and calls them names, the fire inside you may eventually become all that's left of you, as Gehenna, the smoldering garbage dump of ancient Jerusalem, may take you over completely. So what we have in this passage is not one other rule to add on to our legalistic Christian check-in-the-box list. No, what Jesus is doing is what he's been doing the whole Sermon on the Mount, saying look inside. It's not what goes into you that defiles, it's what comes out, and what comes out of your mouth is a reflection of what's on the inside. So examine your heart, because God examines every word. Jesus is calling us to introspection, to looking beyond the surface. Do we pass the test? I don't know. I called a lot of people fools. This passage makes me need to do some introspection. Why don't you join me in that? Let's continue to follow the one who's the truth with the capital T. There's been another edition of Superhero Seminary. Go see the other sessions and lectures in this series over on our YouTube page. Subscribe if you like it and want to see more. Take care, class, and we'll see you next time.